Everyone got this film wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally, structurally, philosophically wrong. The consensus on outside is this. Carlo Ledesma made a Filipino zombie film that uses the undead as wallpaper for a portrait of generational trauma. Francis Abel, haunted by his abusive father, cracks under apocalyptic pressure and becomes the very monster who shaped him. The zombies outside are scary. The man inside is scarier. Cycle of abuse, sins of the father. The real horror was the family dysfunction we found along the way. That reading is comfortable. It's also a lie the film tells you about itself, and that Francis tells himself about himself, and that you accepted without question because it's the narrative structure you came preloaded to recognize. Here's the argument. Francis Abel was not broken by the zombie apocalypse. He was not transformed by pressure. He was not triggered into becoming his father by the trauma of finding his mother reanimated and his father's suicide note in the basement of a sugar plantation. None of that made him into what he becomes in the second half of this film. He was already there. What the apocalypse gave Francis wasn't a breakdown, it gave him something far more dangerous. Permission. Permission to do what men like Francis have always wanted to do. Control the information, control the exits, control the bodies of the people he claims to love without having to invent a reason. The zombies didn't create the prison. They locked the gates of a prison Francis had been quietly constructing for years. And the film knows this. It's been trying to tell you this since the first frame. You just weren't listening to what it was actually saying because you were busy listening to what Francis was saying about himself. That distinction between what a film shows and what its characters narrate is exactly where outside lives, and it's exactly where every critical reading of this film has failed to go. Let's start with what everyone does cite. Critics and audiences almost universally landed on the generational trauma thesis. The film explores mental illness, generational trauma, and how the parents' mistakes harm their children. Francis's childhood trauma at the hands of his father returns to haunt him. The entire film is, essentially, about Francis being unable to escape the cycle of abuse and becoming his father. These are the pull quotes. This is the critical consensus. This is the reading that Screen Rant, Decider, and every Filipino film review coalesced around within 48 hours of the Netflix release. And all of it misses the point entirely. The cycle of abuse, reading positions. Francis is a victim first, perpetrator second. It says, something happened to this man, and that something broke something in him, and that brokenness ricocheted onto his family. It is, at its core, a story of causality, X caused Y, trauma caused monstrosity. You can feel bad for him while condemning him. You can understand him while rejecting him. It's the comfortable reading because it gives you both moral clarity and sympathy simultaneously. The abuser becomes comprehensible without becoming excusable. It's tidy. But watch what the film actually does. Not what it says. Not what Francis says, what it shows. Francis, before the apocalypse has a chance to break him, is already controlling. The first sign isn't the flashbacks or the basement. It's his insistence from the moment they arrive at the mansion that he is the sole arbiter of their reality. His response to Iris's restlessness isn't reassurance, it's information management. He decides what they know. He decides what the sounds outside mean. He decides whether the van works, whether the radio is worth listening to, whether Diego's visit was a threat or a gift. Every decision made in that house is routed through Francis before anyone else gets to weigh in. This isn't a man cracking under pressure. This is a man who has found the optimal conditions for a control architecture he's been building his entire adult life. Here's the question nobody asks: who was Francis before the apocalypse? The film tells you in fragments. There's debt. There's marital strain so deep and long-standing that a single apocalyptic crisis hasn't created it. It's already calcified. The affair with Diego didn't just happen during the chaos of the outbreak. It happened in the before. Iris didn't turn to Diego because Francis broke down under zombie pressure. She turned to Diego before any of this, which means the marriage, the control, the distance, all of it predates the first zombie. The apocalypse didn't damage Francis's marriage. The apocalypse just stripped away the pretenses that were holding the appearance of a marriage together. That's not a trauma spiral. That's a mask slipping. And the mask that slips, the face beneath it, isn't a wounded child reenacting his father's abuse in some unconscious psychological loop. It's something more calculated, something colder. It's a man who looked at the end of the world and saw, with absolute clarity, that the social structures that had previously required him to perform normalcy, the neighbors, the jobs, the extended family, the social infrastructure of accountability, were gone. And in their place was exactly the kind of closed system he'd always needed. No police, no Diego as a legitimate alternative authority, no possibility of Iris leaving with the kids because the world outside the gates is, he insists, full of the undead. No way to verify his claims, no witnesses, no courts, no consequences. The zombie apocalypse for a man like Francis isn't a catastrophe, it's an architecture. Now, here's where I want to push even further, because the Francis always had these tendencies. Reading is still only halfway to the thesis. Some will acknowledge that Francis exhibited controlling behaviors before the flashback started, but they'll frame it as latent tendencies, seeds that the apocalypse watered into full growth. He had impulses. The apocalypse amplified them. Still causally linked. Still the trauma spiral, just with an additional environmental accelerant. That reading is still too generous to Francis and too convenient for us. The evidence that breaks the causal chain entirely is the murder of Cira. This is not a man acting on impulse. This is not a man in the grip of trauma-induced paranoia making a catastrophic decision in a moment of psychological crisis. This is a man who, upon receiving information that directly threatened his control over the household, the soldier confirming the safe zone, confirming the zombies are dwindling, confirming that Diego had been guiding people to safety before his death, made a strategic decision to eliminate that information source. He killed the soldier. He put on the soldier's uniform. He lied about everything the soldier had said. Think about what that sequence requires. It requires Francis to assess the threat Cira posed to his authority, to calculate that allowing him to live would unravel the narrative Francis had been constructing, to physically murder another human being, to then costume himself in the dead man's identity in order to impersonate the credibility of an outside authority source, and then to walk back into the room with his wife and children and continue lying without any visible psychological disruption. That's not trauma. That's not the cycle of abuse. That's not a man becoming his father in some tragic unconscious repetition. That's premeditation. That's strategy. That's someone operating with full cognitive clarity toward a specific goal, maintaining dominance over a captive population. The zombie apocalypse didn't make Francis capable of that murder. The apocalypse just created the conditions under which the murder would go uninvestigated. So here's what Outside is actually about, and why it matters more than the reading everyone defaulted to. Outside is a film about how predatory control operates behind the mask of protection. It's a film about how the "I did this for us, I did this to keep us safe" justification, the most common alibi in the literature of intimate partner abuse, gets its most literal, most nakedly obvious dramatization when the thing being protected against is the actual walking dead. Because the genius of the zombie apocalypse as a setting for this story isn't that it metaphorically represents trauma or abuse cycles, it's that it literalizes the abuser's core argument. Francis doesn't have to manufacture the threat. The threat is real. There are zombies outside. He really does know the mansion better than anyone. He really is, in some material sense, the person most equipped to navigate the physical dangers. The zombie apocalypse makes the protector role real, and in making it real, it gives Francis the one thing that abusers always need but rarely have: an objective, externally verifiable justification for everything. The cycle of abuse reading says, Francis became monstrous despite being in a position to protect his family. The actual reading is, Francis became monstrous using his position as protector. The protection wasn't cover for the abuse. The protection was the abuse. The two were never separate. That's the reading that disturbs. That's the reading that has something urgent to say about every household where the person who controls the information, controls the exits, controls the money, controls the narrative, insists that they do it all in the name of safety. Francis Abel isn't a trauma victim who became his father. He's a man who found, in the end of the world, the perfect proof of concept for a philosophy he'd always held. The apocalypse wasn't what broke him. It was the best day of his life. The thesis isn't an impression. It's not a vibe. It's not a provocative reframe that sounds smart at a dinner party but dissolves on contact with the film's actual content. It's built scene by scene on a structure of evidence that the film plants openly, consistently, and with a precision that only becomes visible once you stop watching Francis the way Francis wants you to watch him, as a man unraveling, and start watching him the way the camera watches him, as a man executing. Let's build the case. Start where the film wants you to look away: the staged zombie attack. At this point in the film, Francis has already established that the van is inoperable, his claim, unverified, that the zombie threat outside remains too severe to risk an evacuation, his assessment, unchallengeable, and that the mansion is their only viable refuge, his decision, unilateral. Iris has begun to notice that the zombies seem to be weakening. She articulates it first, the realization that the horde is thinning, that the undead may be dying off, that the window might be opening for an escape to the safe zone they heard about on the radio. This is a problem for Francis, not because it's untrue, she's right, and the film confirms it, but because it's a direct threat to the information monopoly he depends on. If the zombie threat is diminishing, the case for staying inside collapses. If the case for staying inside collapses, so does Francis's role as the sole authoritative arbiter of the household's survival calculus. If that role goes, everything goes. The rationale for controlling what his family hears, where they go, who they speak to, what exits are available to them. So Francis stages an attack. He goes outside, he creates a disturbance. He makes it appear that the zombie threat is, in fact, escalating rather than receding. He comes back in. He confirms, with the authority of direct observation, that Iris's hopeful assessment was wrong and that staying is the only option. Take a moment with the specific cognitive requirements of this act. Francis has to, 1, correctly assess that Iris's observation is accurate, 2, identify it as a threat to his control, 3, formulate a plan to counter it through manufactured evidence, 4, execute that plan physically and without detection, 5, re-enter the household and deliver the lie without any behavioral tell. This is not the behavior of a man in psychological freefall. This is not the behavior of a man in psychological freefall. Paranoia is an incorrect threat assessment held with irrational intensity. What Francis does here is a correct threat assessment. He correctly identifies that the diminishing zombie threat would loosen his grip, followed by a rational, calculated, successfully executed counteroperation. This is the action of someone who is thinking clearly, the kind of clear thinking that only happens when you know exactly what you want and you're willing to do what's required to keep it. The zombie apocalypse didn't make Francis paranoid, it made him efficient. Now the burned map. Diego arrives. And Diego, despite being framed through Francis's resentful narration as a deadbeat, as a predatory opportunist who slept with his brother's wife, as someone not to be trusted, Diego does something that should disrupt the cycle of abuse reading entirely. He tries to help. He lures away the zombie horde at personal risk to himself. He brings a map to the safe zone. He offers to accompany the family. He does this even after Francis has treated him with naked hostility, even after everything. And Francis burns the map at the dinner table, in front of his wife and children. He takes Diego's map, the piece of paper representing the possibility of safety, of freedom, of an exit from his controlled environment, and he sets it on fire. The critical consensus frames this as an act of jealousy. Francis knows about the affair. Joshua isn't his son. Diego represents not just the zombie apocalypse's outside threat, but the pre-apocalyptic betrayal that has festered in Francis's marriage. The burning of the map is read as jealousy transmuted into self-destructive irrationality. The broken husband doing something stupid out of hurt. Wrong. Watch it again. The burning of the map is an act of perfect clarity. Francis isn't acting out of hurt, he's acting out of strategy. The map isn't just a piece of paper representing Diego's goodwill. The map is an exit, a concrete, navigable alternative to Francis's management of their situation. A thing that, if kept, would give Iris and Joshua the practical means to leave him. Not just the desire to leave him, but the mechanism to do so. He doesn't burn the map because he's jealous of Diego. He burns it because the map is a threat to the closed system he's built. And he burns it publicly in front of everyone so that they all understand simultaneously that the exit has been destroyed and that he was the one who destroyed it and that he did so without apology. This is a demonstration of power. It's not even particularly disguised. It's Francis telling his family, I know about the exit. I decided you don't get it. What are you going to do? The generational trauma reading needs Francis to be spiraling. A man spiraling doesn't execute strategic demolitions of escape routes in a single deliberate gesture. A man spiraling doesn't stage outdoor zombie attacks, construct a false information narrative, and then burn the map that would expose the falsity of that narrative. All in sequence, all with consistent internal logic serving a single goal. That's not a spiral, that's a program. And then there's the murder of Cira, which I flagged in Module 1 and which I want to spend real time on now because it is the scene that, more than any other, should have permanently blown up the Francis as trauma victim reading. Cira arrives wounded, seeking shelter. He's a soldier, credentialed with direct knowledge of the outside world. He tells the family about Delta Camp. He confirms the zombies are diminishing. He reveals that Diego was alive and actively guiding people to safety before he died. Every piece of information Cira delivers is a fact. Every fact is also a direct falsification of something Francis has told his family. The zombies are weakening, Francis told them they were strengthening. Delta Camp exists and is reachable. Francis has implied that any hope of organized safe zones was fantasy. Diego was a good man trying to help, not the predatory deadbeat Francis framed him as. Cira isn't just a guest. Cira is a one-man audit of everything Francis has constructed. And Francis, who has been watching this audit unfold in real time, watching his family's faces as each revelation lands, makes a decision, ... He kills the soldier, and he puts on his uniform. The uniform is the detail that gets underplayed. It's also the most damning detail in the entire film. Why wear it? Why take the time with your family nearby to strip the man you've just murdered and dress yourself in his clothes? Because the uniform is credibility. It is, literally, the physical garment of an authoritative outside source. By wearing it, Francis is attempting to absorb the information authority that Cira represented, while simultaneously destroying the actual Cira who came with contradictory information. He doesn't just kill the witness, he skins the witness and wears the credibility. If that sounds extreme, it should. Because it is extreme, and it is cold, and it is methodical, and it is the action of a man who is absolutely not in the grip of a trauma flashback, who is not dissociating, not cycling through unconscious repetitions of his father's behavior, but who is making a series of conscious, sequenced decisions that require sustained cognitive clarity and a complete absence of guilt. That absence of guilt is what matters. Somewhere in the momentum of the cycle of abuse reading, Francis gets to be guilty. Implicitly or explicitly, the framing implies he suffers for what he does, that the flashbacks are punishment, that his downward spiral is its own kind of penance. Watch him after he kills Cira. He walks back into the house, he lies, he continues. There is no hesitation. There is no visible psychological disruption. There is no crack in the performance. This is a man who has killed someone and is now lying about it and is entirely, functionally fine. That's not trauma cycling, that's character. Let's talk about the flashbacks because this is where the opposition will push back hardest and where the thesis requires the most precise work. The flashbacks to Francis's childhood in the basement, his father's violence, the confinement, the abuse, are the film's primary visual evidence for the generational trauma reading. They appear. They're viscerally disturbing. They show a real, terrible thing that happened to a child. They position Francis unmistakably as a victim of his father's cruelty. And in the critical consensus, they're read as the key to Francis's psychology. He was made this way, he was made by this place, and returning to this place reactivates the original wound, which then infects everything. Here's the problem with that reading. Watch when the flashbacks appear. The flashbacks don't appear randomly. They don't appear consistently whenever Francis enters the basement or handles memories of his childhood. They appear at specific, convenient moments. They appear when Francis is about to be held accountable. They appear when the emotional or moral pressure on him is highest. They appear as interruption, as a cut away from a scene of Francis doing something indefensible to a scene of Francis having something indefensible done to him. This is the editing as argument. The film's editor is making a case, visually, that Francis's past explains his present. And within the internal logic of a cycle of abuse reading, that case works. But here's the twist. The flashbacks aren't presented from an omniscient narrative perspective that validates them as an objective causal link. They're presented from Francis's perspective. We're seeing what Francis sees. We're seeing what Francis shows us. And Francis is an established, documented, premeditated liar. Why should his flashbacks be exempt from that characterization? This isn't a rhetorical gambit, it's a formal observation about the film's narration. Everything else Francis tells us, about the van, about the zombies, about Diego, about the outside world, is revealed to be a lie. He lies to his family. He lies through action, the staged attack. He lies through omission, Diego's map. He lies through impersonation, the soldier's uniform. Why, in this context of total informational unreliability, do we extend the flashbacks the status of objective truth? What if the flashbacks are part of the same apparatus? Not lies in the sense that the abuse didn't happen, it clearly did, but lies in the sense that Francis uses the flashbacks the way he uses everything, as a tool for maintaining a particular narrative about himself. The narrative that says, I am a victim, I was made this way, my violence is the overflow of someone else's violence. The real author of this horror is the dead man in the basement, not me. This is the logic of the cycle of abuse reading when it's operating in bad faith. And Francis operates entirely in bad faith. The flashbacks are real. The abuse was real. The suffering was real. The suffering was real. But the use Francis makes of that suffering, the way he positions it as the explanation for and implicit justification of everything he does, is the abuse. It's the meta-abuse. The father hit Francis. Francis hits his family. And then Francis points at the father as the author of the second set of hits, erasing his own agency in the process. I became my father is the most seductive, most socially legible, most emotionally resonant story Francis could tell about himself. It's also the story that most effectively distributes his guilt into the past, onto a dead man who can't rebut it. It's the story that makes Iris feel sad instead of just angry. It's the story that makes Joshua wonder whether to forgive instead of just leave. It's the story that makes the audience say, I understand why he's like this, instead of, he knows exactly what he's doing. The flashbacks in this reading are not the wound. They are the dressing that Francis applies to the wound he inflicts on others so that everyone looks at the bandage instead of the knife. The literalization of this reading comes in the film's most on-the-nose moment, Francis locking his family in the basement, the exact room where his father imprisoned him. The cycle of abuse reading hears this as tragic irony. He becomes his father precisely in the space where he was his father's victim. The location collapses the generational distance. The repetition is the horror. All of that is true on the surface, but beneath the tragic irony is a specific, chilling choice that the cycle of abuse reading cannot explain. Francis knows what that room does to a person. He knows from the inside he lived in that room. He knows the particular psychology of being confined in it, the way it isolates, the way it removes all external reference points, the way it makes the jailer the only source of information about the outside world. He's not accidentally recreating the conditions of his childhood abuse. He's choosing the most effective confinement tool he knows, the one he knows from direct experience works, and deploying it deliberately. A man acting from unconscious traumatic repetition would not necessarily choose the most refined, most personally tested version of the abuse instrument. A man acting from conscious choice picks the tool he knows works. That room works. Francis knows it works. He doesn't stumble into it. He builds toward it. The film gives Francis a second son, not a metaphorical second son, an actual one. Lucas, the younger child, unambiguously Francis's biological son. And then there is Joshua the elder, who is, as Francis eventually and publicly reveals at the dinner table, actually Diego's son, not Francis's. The standard reading process is this as one of Francis's wounds. The betrayal, the uncertainty about paternity, the humiliation of having raised another man's child. It slots neatly into the portrait of a wronged husband whose grievances become explosively disproportionate. But watch what the revelation does in terms of what Francis subsequently protects. Francis doesn't spiral equally across both children. He spirals toward Joshua, the non-biological son, the living embodiment of the affair, the child whose face may carry physical traces of Diego, with something close to hostility. And he circles Lucas with something closer to what, in a better man, we might call love. The distinction is the argument. Because if this were purely trauma cycling, if Francis's abuse were the unconscious overflow of his father's violence, it should be non-discriminatory. Abusers who are operating from unconscious repetition don't tend to stop and calculate which child represents a threat to their ownership and which doesn't. Unconscious repetition doesn't discriminate by paternity, it just repeats. But Francis discriminates. Very clearly, very deliberately, he favors Lucas. He rejects Joshua. The differential treatment maps almost perfectly onto the differential biology, which means the differential treatment isn't the product of blind rage. It's the product of a specific, conscious assessment of whose child is whose, and therefore whose child is his, and therefore whose child deserves his protection, versus whose child represents an ongoing humiliation. This is the possessive calculus of ownership, not the traumatic overflow of abuse. And then there is the bridge sequence, the one scene in the film where Francis is genuinely, unambiguously heroic. He goes out onto the bridge, he fights through a horde of zombies. It's an extended, technically impressive single-shot sequence. That is, from a pure action cinema standpoint, the film's most kinetically alive moment. And critics have cited it as evidence of Francis's fundamental decency, proof that beneath the control and the violence, there is still a man capable of real sacrifice. Who is Francis fighting to protect in that sequence? Lucas, his biological son, his real son. the child he doesn't need to share with Diego's memory. The bridge sequence isn't evidence of Francis's redeemable humanity. It's evidence of the selective, conditional, possessive nature of his love. He will risk his life for Lucas. He will fight through a zombie horde for Lucas. He will do the heroic thing, but only within the narrow category of people he considers his. The man who burns Diego's map, because it represents an exit for people he doesn't fully own, will fight through the undead for the child he does fully own. It's the same logic operating in both directions. What's mine, I protect. What challenges my ownership, I destroy. That's not love, that's property management. One final evidence cluster, and it's the one that requires the least decoding because the film practically annotates it. Francis's construction of himself as wronged party, wronged husband, wronged son, wronged patriarch is so consistent and so all-encompassing that it functions as a kind of identity. Francis is always the victim. The affair makes him a victim. His father's abuse makes him a victim. The zombie apocalypse makes him a victim. Diego's goodness, which throws Francis's bad behavior into relief, by contrast, makes him a victim of comparison. Even the zombies that threaten his family are framed as yet another thing attacking Francis specifically, as though the undead have a personal grievance with him. This is the victimhood apparatus in full operation, and it does something very specific. It makes every act of aggression Francis commits a response. It reframes control as defense. It reframes imprisonment as protection. It reframes the burn map as grief, the staged attack as fear, the murdered soldier as madness. A man who is always responding is, by definition, never initiating. And a man who is never initiating cannot be held fully responsible for what he does. Francis's genius, and let's use that word deliberately, with its morally neutral connotation of operational sophistication, is that he has constructed a self-narrative in which he is always the reactive party. His abuse is always a response to something. His control is always a response to threat. His violence is always a response to provocation. The affair, in particular, is used brilliantly by the film, not to generate sympathy for Francis, though casual viewers extend it anyway, but to demonstrate exactly how the victimhood apparatus works. Iris's infidelity is real. It was wrong. Francis's anger at it is legitimate. And Francis will use every gram of that legitimacy to justify every subsequent thing he does. Watch how the revelation about Joshua's paternity is deployed. Not in private, not in a moment of genuine marital crisis, but at the dinner table, in front of the children, at a moment of maximum public humiliation for Iris and maximum performative injury for Francis. He doesn't reveal it because the truth matters to him. He reveals it because revealing it publicly is a weapon, a way to simultaneously destroy Iris's authority in the household, diminish Joshua's sense of security, and position Francis as the long-suffering patriarch whose patience has finally snapped. He chose that moment. He chose that audience. He had the information about Joshua's paternity before this dinner. He waited for the moment when deploying it would do the most damage to his enemies and the most work for his control architecture. That's not a man driven to breaking point. That's a tactician. Taken together, these four evidence groups, the control architecture, the basement logic, the love hierarchy, and the victimhood apparatus, describe a man who has, across the entire film, from the first scene to the last, been operating with a consistent, coherent, strategically sophisticated program of dominance over his family. The zombie apocalypse appears in all of these groups not as the cause of anything, but as the setting for something that was already in motion. The mansion isn't where Francis's trauma was activated, it's where his agenda stopped having to hide. The monsters were never outside, they were always inside, calling it protection. Let's be fair, the counter-arguments against this thesis are serious. They're not straw men. The cycle of abuse, Reading isn't stupid, it's the film's own preferred self-presentation, which means it has the authority of the text behind it, more or less. If the argument were easy to dismiss, this essay would be unnecessary. So let's take them one by one. Let's take them at their strongest, and then let's show why they don't hold. The most direct objection to the thesis is the simplest one. The flashbacks show us something real. Francis was abused as a child. That abuse was formative. The film returns to it repeatedly, framing it as the psychological engine driving Francis's deterioration. To argue that the flashbacks are Francis's alibi is to effectively deny that childhood abuse has long-term psychological consequences, which is not just empirically false, but morally irresponsible. This is the strongest version of the counterargument, and I want to be clear, it lands. Partly, childhood abuse has profound, documented, long-term consequences. This is not in dispute. The thesis doesn't deny that Francis was damaged by his father. It doesn't even deny that the damage is real and present and operative throughout the film. What the thesis disputes is the sufficiency of that damage as an explanation for Francis's behavior. The claim isn't Francis wasn't traumatized. The claim is Francis's trauma does not account for the strategic, premeditated, cognitively sophisticated nature of what he does. Here's the distinction in concrete terms. Trauma can produce flashbacks, hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, difficulty with intimacy, heightened threat responses. What trauma does not produce, what no psychological literature describes as a trauma symptom, is the capacity to murder a witness and then wear his uniform in order to impersonate his credibility for an ongoing deception operation. That's not dysregulation, that's planning. The flashbacks are real. Francis's suffering is real. The cycle of abuse thesis uses that real suffering to explain everything, and that overreach is exactly where it fails. Not all of Francis's behavior can be attributed to the trauma. The most deliberate, most strategically sophisticated behaviors, the ones that require the most calculation and the most cold-bloodedness, are inexplicable under the trauma model and only explicable under the thesis. This is a man who knows what he's doing. Trauma explains the cracks in the facade. It does not explain the facade. This is the authorial intent objection, and it's the one that should give us the most pause. Carlo Ledesma made this film. Carlo Ledesma wrote this film. And in interviews and critical framings around the film, the generational trauma reading is clearly the framework the film was constructed within. Comparing it to Cinematographic, describing Francis's downward spiral as the main element. Framing the zombies as a vehicle for exploring how parents' mistakes harm children. If the director says the film is about generational trauma, doesn't the thesis collapse? Don't we have to defer to authorial intent? No, and here's why. Directors lie, not intentionally, not maliciously, but the statement, "My film is about X," is not the same as the film being about X. It's the director's reading of their own work. And directors are often the least reliable readers of their own films precisely because they're inside the process that produced the work. They know what they intended. They don't necessarily have access to what they made. What Ledesma made is a film whose most disturbing scenes, the staged attack, the murder of Corcara, the burning of the map, are not adequately explained by the generational trauma framework. If Francis were cycling trauma, if he were an unconscious repetition machine recapitulating his father's violence in a dissociated psychological fog, none of those actions would look the way they look. They would look impulsive, reactive, emotionally driven. They don't. They look calculated. They look like a man making a series of strategic decisions in full command of his cognitive faculties. The film, in making those decisions look that way, surpasses its own stated intent. It says more than it means to say. And what it says, in excess of its director's thematic intention, is the actual argument of this essay. This is not a trauma victim being overwhelmed by repetition. This is a predator operating efficiently. There's also something worth saying about the Mata comparison. Mike DeLeon's 1981 masterpiece is indeed, as one reviewer observed, in the same Filipino patriarchal horror lineage. But Mata is about a father whose possessiveness is so total and so foundational to his identity that it defies psychological explanation. It just is him, fully, without backstory or mitigation or cycle of abuse framing. The horror of Mata is the horror of something that doesn't need an explanation to be true. In Outside invoked Mata comparisons but hedged its bet by adding the trauma backstory, making Francis legible through psychology rather than forcing the audience to confront the raw horror of a man who simply is this way. That hedge, that retreat from the Mata-style confrontation with pure, unexplained, patriarchal monstrosity is the film's one significant weakness. And ironically, reading against it, reading past the psychological mitigation, gets you closer to the truly disturbing version of the film that the Mata comparison was gesturing toward. Ledesma invoked Mata and then flinched. This thesis argues we shouldn't. In the film's final act, Francis has a moment of something that reads, at first glance, like genuine humanity. He's locked in the basement, paralyzed by flashbacks, by the recursion of trauma, while upstairs his family is being attacked by a zombified Diego. And it's the screams of Iris and Lucas that finally break through. Francis escapes the basement. He kills the zombified Diego. He is, for a brief moment, the protector he has always claimed to be. The argument, if Francis were purely a predator, purely a strategic monster without genuine love for his family, this moment couldn't exist. The redemption arc, however partial, proves that the film is offering Francis as a tragic human figure, not a monster. And a tragedy requires something valuable in the tragic figure that makes the fall worth mourning. This is the counter-argument that comes closest to landing, and the reason it comes closest is because the scene it's describing is genuinely affecting on an emotional register that the thesis doesn't want to dismiss. But here's what the scene actually shows. Francis rescues Lucas, not the family, not Iris, not Joshua, the child he exposed at dinner, the child he has treated with barely concealed contempt, the child who found Diego's map and confronted him. Francis rescues Lucas, his biological son, the one whose possession he was certain of. This is not redemption. This is the love hierarchy confirming itself, the evidence, in the end, of what Francis is capable of, under the right conditions for the right person, is not evidence of universal humanity breaking through. It's evidence that his love, such as it is precisely as possessive, conditional, and ownership-based as the thesis has argued all along. A man who proves his love by fighting through zombies for the child he biologically owns is not a redeemed patriarch. He's a man whose protective instincts are organized around the logic of property, and who, under sufficient threat to his property, will fight with genuine ferocity. That ferocity is real. That love, within its own narrow definition, is real. But it is not the love that redeems Francis. It is the love that defines him, selective, hierarchical, conditional on belonging. The moment doesn't give Francis back his humanity. It shows us precisely and finally what his humanity actually looked like all along. Having addressed all three counter-arguments, let me state what the opposition collectively reveals about the thesis. Each counter-argument is strongest in the areas where the thesis makes its most discomforting demands. That Francis's trauma was real but strategically deployed. That the film's conscious intent was surpassed by its formal execution. That even his most humanizing moment is organized around the logic of possession rather than love. Those are demanding claims. They require the viewer to do the uncomfortable work of watching Francis without sympathy. not without understanding, but without the sympathy that understanding is usually leveraged to generate. The film does not make that easy. It's structured to offer you sympathy for Francis at regular intervals. The flashbacks, the betrayal backstory, the he's struggling framing, all of it is designed to keep you in the position of the reluctant sympathizer, the person who understands why Francis is like this, even as you condemn what he does. The thesis asks you to break that structure, to watch what he does instead of listening to what his history says he's doing, to see the man behind the backstory operating with clarity and purpose and something very close to satisfaction. Because that's the disturbing truth the film keeps almost saying and then retreating from. Francis, at the center of a zombie apocalypse in the mansion where his father abused him, with his marriage in ruins and his family imprisoned, Francis is not suffering. Francis is, finally, exactly where he's always wanted to be. Film theses don't live in a vacuum. The argument about what outside is actually doing doesn't matter unless it connects to something real, something outside the film, in the culture that produced it and the culture that received it. Because if the film is only about Francis Abel, the argument is an intellectual exercise. If the film is about something we recognize in the world, the argument is an indictment. It is an indictment. Outside is a Filipino film made by a Filipino director set in a Filipino household, drawing explicitly on a tradition of Filipino domestic horror that goes back at least to Mata. To watch it without understanding the cultural architecture it's interrogating is to miss the most precise and pointed layer of what the film is doing. EDD. The Philippines has one of the highest rates of reported domestic abuse in Southeast Asia. The statistics around COVID-19 lockdowns and domestic violence are, globally, staggering. The United Nations described the surge in intimate partner violence during lockdown periods as a shadow pandemic. But in the Philippines specifically, the structural features of the lockdown, the mandatory confinement to the family home, the collapse of the external social infrastructure that had previously provided some measure of accountability and exit created conditions that were, from the perspective of anyone paying attention to the dynamics of domestic abuse, almost perfectly designed to amplify the behavior of controlling partners. The Philippine Commission on Women reported significantly elevated domestic violence incidents during lockdown periods. Hotlines were overwhelmed. The specific legal architecture of the country, in which divorce remained illegal until very recently, in which the Catholic Church's influence on family law has historically constrained options for separation, meant that confinement to the family home was not merely a practical limitation, but a legal and cultural one. Outside came out in October 2024. Outside came out in October 2024, 4 years after a Philippine COVID lockdown that generated some 4,260 reported cases of violence against women and children in its first 4 months alone. With the Women and Children's Desk in Quezon City processing more than twice the number of complaints per week during the first 2 weeks of lockdown than it had been receiving before the pandemic. By June 2020, Philippine National Police records showed 1,944 cases of violence against women and 1,754 cases of violence against children, and those are the reported cases in a country where reporting has always been structurally suppressed by legal, religious, and social pressure. A 2017 Philippine National Demographic and Health Survey had already established that 1 in 4 Filipino women aged 15-49 had experienced domestic violence at least once in their lives. The lockdowns didn't create that statistic. They accelerated it. They created the conditions, confined to the family home, reduced access to shelters, restricted mobility, economic dependence amplified, that allowed controlling partners to exercise control more completely than the pre-pandemic architecture of social life had permitted. You could, without much effort, write a sociological case study of the Philippine COVID lockdown experience and use Francis Abel as your primary case illustration. The mansion is the locked house. The zombies are the community quarantine. Francis is the controlling partner who, once the external infrastructure of accountability dissolved, was finally free to manage his family the way he'd always wanted to. Ledesma made this film, explicitly, as a Filipino film, not a genre exercise with Filipino faces, but something that engaged with things that only Filipinos can understand. The specific social architecture his film inhabits is not universally shared. It requires a deeply patriarchal familial structure in which the male head of household is both culturally authorized and legally difficult to challenge, a Catholic framework in which family dissolution carries enormous moral weight and social cost, an economic structure in which exit from an abusive household often requires resources that women systematically lack, and a political tradition in which authoritarian male control of a closed domestic space has deep cultural and historical resonance. That last point connects to Mata. Mike De Leon's 1981 masterpiece is among the greatest Filipino films ever made, a brutal, unflinching portrait of patriarchal control at its most pathological. Its patriarch, Dedong, is a retired police officer who exercises absolute dominion over his family through a combination of physical violence, emotional terrorism, and the weaponization of the institutional authority his former position granted him. The film included the first major treatment of incest in the history of Philippine cinema. De Leon framed Dedong's possessive control over his daughter, his absolute refusal to allow her to marry, to separate, to escape, as simultaneously a personal pathology and a political allegory, the household as the nation under Marcos, the patriarch as dictator, the silenced women as the silenced citizenry. The extension of the critique was palpable. Dedong doesn't need a trauma backstory. He doesn't need the audience's sympathy. He is simply a man who has constructed a closed system of total control, and the film watches him with the cold eye of a documentarian rather than the warm eye of a psychologist. Mata is the film that Outside wants to be and, in its most honest moments, nearly becomes, but where Mata refuses to explain Dedong, presenting him as a fact of a certain kind of patriarchal world, requiring no mitigation, no backstory, no psychological architecture. Outside equips Francis with the backstory, the flashbacks, the generational abuse explanation, and that equipping, that protective scaffolding around the monster, is precisely the move that softens the film's most disturbing implication. Ledesma has spoken about wanting the film to prompt conversations about generational trauma, about breaking the cycle, about recognizing and interrupting the patterns. These are genuinely important social goals. The problem is that framing Francis's behavior as the output of a trauma cycle implicitly frames the solution as therapeutic. If people can recognize the cycle, they can break it. If Francis had access to different resources, better support, mental health intervention, the violence could have been prevented. That framing, well-intentioned as it is, inadvertently locates the problem in individual psychology rather than in structural power. It says, the problem is that Francis was damaged. It doesn't say, the problem is that the social, legal, and cultural architecture of Filipino patriarchy provided Francis with permission structures that would have allowed a man of his disposition to behave this way even without the trauma. The cycle of abuse reading is therapeutic. The thesis of this essay is structural, and the difference is not academic. It determines where you look for solutions. If the problem is trauma, you treat the traumatized. If the problem is that controlling men have always found contexts, familial, institutional, apocalyptic, in which to exercise control under the cover of protection, then the intervention is different entirely. It requires dismantling the permission structures, the cultural narratives that say the patriarch knows best, that confinement is care, that control is love, the legal architectures that make exit difficult, the social norms that frame the family as a closed system that outsiders, including institutions of accountability, should not enter. Outside, read against itself, makes that structural argument with more precision and urgency than it makes its own stated therapeutic one. Because what Francis needs isn't therapy. What he needed all along was a world that refused to give him permission. Let me pull in a philosophical framework that the film keeps approaching without quite naming. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, developed in her coverage of the Eichmann trial and elaborated in her later political writings, describes the way that catastrophic harm can be perpetuated not by monsters in any psychological sense, but by ordinary, functionally rational people operating within systems that normalize and reward certain behaviors. Eichmann, Arendt argued, was not motivated by ideological hatred in the operatic sense. He was motivated by careerism, by institutional compliance, by a bureaucratic mind that had evacuated moral thinking in favor of procedural thinking. The evil was banal because the man performing it was, in most respects, ordinary. The application to Francis is not exact. Arendt was writing about political evil at scale, not intimate partner violence, but the structure of the argument maps in an illuminating way. Francis is not a psychopath in the clinical sense. He is not incapable of love or social feeling. He functions, he reasons, he plans, he, at moments, genuinely cares about the people he's hurting. What he lacks is not the capacity for moral reasoning, but the habit of applying it to his own behavior, the willingness to stop and ask whether what he's doing is acceptable rather than simply whether it's effective. The flashbacks in this reading are the mechanism by which Francis evacuates moral accountability. They're the procedure he follows whenever the question of responsibility arises. He consults the trauma. He finds the cause. He exits the moral question. The procedure is so practiced, so smooth, so quick that it functions like a bureaucratic form. Fill in the fields. Submit. The accountability is discharged. He was abused. He abused. The cycle explains it. The explanation completes the process. No further moral examination required. This is the banality of domestic evil. Not performed wickedness, but the systematic replacement of moral self-examination with procedural self-excuse. The flashback isn't a psychological symptom, it's an administrative tool, and it is terrifying precisely because it is so normal. Because Francis's particular form of this administrative evasion. My behavior is explained by my past, and explanation is the same as exculpation, is, in some form or another, one of the most common strategies by which controlling and abusive people navigate the ordinary social expectations of accountability. Every Francis has a flashback, not necessarily a visual one, not necessarily as dramatic as a dead father in a basement, but a story. A backstory, a reason that the control is justified, that the imprisonment is care, that the burned map was grief rather than strategy, and the cultural infrastructure, therapeutic, domestic, familial, often has built into it a default sympathy for the backstory. Outside, read the way this essay reads it, asks whether that sympathy is warranted, whether the backstory, even when true, even when genuinely terrible, earns the exculpation it's routinely granted, whether understanding why someone does something is the same as understanding that they chose to do it. The zombie apocalypse in this philosophical frame is the thought experiment that strips the question to its essence. What if there were literally no social consequences? What if you could burn the map without anyone outside the family ever knowing? What if you could kill the soldier and wear his uniform without any investigative infrastructure to catch you? What if the external permission structures, the police, the courts, the extended family, the social network, simply vanished? What would a man like Francis do? Outside answers the question, and the answer isn't comfortable. Outside belongs to a tradition of zombie filmmaking that has, from its origins, been less interested in the undead as a literal horror than in the undead as a vehicle for social critique. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, 1968, was about race in America. Dawn of the Dead, 1978, was about consumerism. 28 Days Later, 2002, was about the thin line between civil society and barbarism. The zombie film, at its most intelligent, has always used the apocalyptic scenario as a permission structure for exposing what human behavior looks like when the social infrastructure of normality is removed. Outside fits this tradition, but it departs from it in a way that the generational trauma reading obscures and the thesis of this essay illuminates. Most zombie films use the apocalypse to reveal what humans become under pressure. Lord of the Flies dynamics, social hierarchies reasserted, tribalism reactivated. The horror in the Romero tradition is what we become without civilization. Outside is doing something different. Francis doesn't become anything under the apocalyptic pressure. He doesn't transform. He doesn't deteriorate into a new form of himself. He simply stops performing the civilized form of himself that the pre-apocalyptic social infrastructure had required. This is the zombie film that says it's not what we become without civilization. It's what we reveal ourselves to have always been once the performance requirement is lifted. That's the more disturbing argument. Because the Romero tradition, for all its bleakness, still carries an implicit plea for civilization, still says that social structures, for all their flaws, perform the important function of suppressing the worst in us. The argument has a kind of institutional conservatism. We need the social order, because without it, the barbarian in us emerges. Outside, read correctly, makes a subtler and more unsettling case that the social order in some of its most intimate configurations, the family, the home, the husband's role as protector, provides permission for control rather than suppression of it. That the home, the most intimate social institution, has historically been the site where a certain kind of man finds the most freedom to exercise domination, not the least. That civilization, in its domestic form, has often been less a cage for the beast than a theater for him. A place where the monster performs domesticity for the audience of the wider social world while doing, behind closed doors, exactly what he would do in the apocalypse. The apocalypse didn't remove the theater, it removed the audience. And without the audience, Francis stopped performing. That is what Outside is really about. And it's what makes it not just a Filipino domestic horror film, but a contribution to the global conversation about intimate partner violence, structural patriarchy, and the political unconscious of the zombie genre. Here's the thing about great filmmaking. It tells the truth even when the filmmaker is trying to tell a different truth. The craft in Outside, the specific, deliberate choices in cinematography, performance, editing rhythm, and sound design consistently supports the thesis of this essay with more precision than the film's own stated thematic intent. This isn't a contradiction. It's what happens when technical execution is honest. The camera doesn't know what the director means. It records what the director does. And what Ledesma does, technically, is build a film whose formal choices describe a predator, not a victim, regardless of the narrative frame the story tries to put around him. Let's examine the specific choices that do the most argumentative work. The dominant visual strategy of Outside is the deployment of the mansion as a space of total surveillance. The film's interior cinematography consistently establishes the mansion not as a refuge, warm, intimate, safe, but as a controlled environment, watched and managed by a single observing consciousness. The framing of interior scenes is architecturally precise. Francis is consistently shot in positions of spatial authority, elevated, at the center of sightlines, at the threshold of doors, positioned where he can see without being fully seen. His family members are consistently framed in positions of spatial vulnerability, in corners, with their backs to walls, in rooms that have only one visible exit, from angles that emphasize the enclosing nature of the space rather than its domestic comfort. This is not accidental, and it's not just establishing the horror setting. This is cinematographic language for power. The camera, through its consistent framing choices, is telling you who controls the space and who is controlled by it, before a single word of dialogue makes that dynamic explicit. The Panopticon, Jeremy Bentham's conceptual prison design, theorized by Michel Foucault as a model for understanding how power operates through the possibility of surveillance, is the relevant analogy here. In the Panopticon, the prisoners never know when they are being watched, so they behave as though they are always being watched. The discipline isn't enforced by constant direct surveillance, it's enforced by the internalization of the watcher's gaze. Francis, in Outside, is positioned throughout the film as the Panopticon's tower. His family members never know what he's watching, what he's heard, what information he already has. The scene in which he appears to know about the affair before anyone confirms it to him, where his behavior toward Joshua shifts before the paternity conversation happens, is the clearest moment of this dynamic. The family has internalized the watcher, and the mansion itself, with its closed gates, its contained perimeter, its single controlled entry and exit, is, architecturally, Bentham's design-made material. This is what the cinematography keeps insisting on. Not, this house is scary because zombies might break in, but this house is scary because someone inside it is always watching. The camera knows who the real threat is. It has known since the first interior frame. The editing choices around the flashback sequences are where the film's formal execution makes the most compelling case for the thesis, and where the gap between the film's intended argument and its actual argument is most visible. As established in Module 2, the flashbacks are strategically placed. They appear at moments of maximum pressure on Francis, at moments when he is about to or has just committed an act of aggression that the narrative frame would need to contextualize. The editing rhythm is, Francis does something indefensible, cut to Francis being subjected to something indefensible. The standard reading processes this as explanation. The film is explaining Francis's behavior by showing its origin. But here is the formal argument that the editing actually makes. If you're watching the cut rather than the content, the flashbacks don't appear before Francis's actions, as a cause that leads to an effect. They appear after or during as a justification that follows a decision. The causal sequence, formally, is decision mash flashback, not flashback mash decision. This is a significant formal distinction. If a character makes a decision because of their trauma, if the trauma is genuinely driving the behavior, the flashback should precede or accompany the decision. It should show us the psychological state entering the action, the way the film cuts to the source of the compulsion as the compulsion fires. But in Outside, the flashbacks systematically follow. Francis burns the map. Then we get the basement imagery. Francis commits the murder. Then we see the father. The formal sequence tells us that the action came first and the psychological justification followed. That Francis did what he did, made his decision, chose his action, and then, for himself and for us, deployed the trauma as retrospective explanation. This is the flashback as alibi in formal terms. The editing structure of the film, at the micro level of cut timing, encodes the thesis of this essay without naming it. Francis's trauma isn't driving his behavior. His behavior drives him to the trauma, reaches back for it, pulls it forward, uses it as the story that makes the action legible in a particular way. Most viewers don't watch the cut timing. They watch the content. They see bad thing happened to Francis in the basement, and Francis does bad things in the present. They draw the causal arrow from past to present. The editing draws it the other way. And the editing doesn't lie. Sid Lucero's performance as Francis is the element of the film that is most consistently cited in positive reviews and most consistently misread. The performance is almost universally described as a portrayal of disintegration, a man coming apart under pressure, losing himself, spiraling. Watch the performance again. What Lucero actually plays, through the vast majority of the film, is not disintegration, it's management. Francis, as Lucero embodies him, is a man who is constantly managing the information landscape of the household, managing how much of himself to reveal in any given interaction, managing the emotional temperature of conversations to keep them within the range he can control. The moments that read as disintegration are, in Lucero's hands, something subtler. They are moments of exposure. When Francis is about to lose control of information, when Corquera is talking to his family, when Iris pushes back too directly, when Diego's visit destabilizes the narrative Francis has constructed, his performance doesn't give you a man falling apart psychologically. It gives you a man recalculating. The eyes shift, the jaw sets, a rapid, barely perceptible processing is happening, and then a decision is made and the face closes again. This is not an actor playing trauma cycling. This is an actor playing strategic assessment. Lucero plays Francis as someone who is, in almost every scene, in full command of his cognitive faculties, which is what makes the occasional eruptions, when they come, so jarring. They're not evidence of a man who can't control himself. They're evidence of a man who has calculated that an eruption at this moment is the optimal strategic choice. The performance that is most relevant here is the sequence immediately following the murder of Corquera. Lucero's Francis walks back into the house in the dead soldier's uniform. He delivers the lie about what Corquera said. He watches his family receive the lie. And in Lucero's eyes, in that moment, there is something that critics have missed entirely, the faintest register of satisfaction. Not guilt, not horror at what he's done, not the psychological disruption of a man who has crossed a moral threshold and is now processing that crossing. Satisfaction, the quiet, brief, professionally contained satisfaction of a plan executed cleanly. You could argue this is subjective, that I'm projecting intent onto a performance, but it's there. And it matters, because that microexpression of satisfaction in Lucero's eyes is the performance equivalent of the editing's flashback as alibi structure. It's the character telling you, in the only way he can without a direct confession, what the film is actually about. Francis isn't unraveling, he's succeeding. The final craft element worth examining is the film's use of sound, specifically the contrast between the audio landscape inside the mansion and outside it. Outside the mansion, the zombie horde. Moaning, snarling, the physical chaos of the undead, the ambient sounds of a world in apocalyptic breakdown. The sound design of the exterior is dense, layered, unpredictable. The sonic signature of chaos, of threat, of a world that has lost its organized coherence. Inside the mansion, silence. The domestic interior of outside is, almost throughout the film, acoustically contained to the point of suffocation. Conversations are conducted at low volumes. The ambient sound of the house is the hum of controlled space, HVAC systems, the sounds of confinement. The zombie chaos leaks in periodically as punctuation, a reminder that the chaos is close, but it never dominates the interior soundscape, the way you'd expect if the film were genuinely about the zombie threat. Instead, the silence of the interior is the dominant audio reality. This is the most precise sound design argument for the thesis. The silence inside the mansion is not the silence of safety, it is the silence of control. The silence of a space in which everything is managed, monitored, where noise, the noise of Iris pushing back, of Joshua questioning, of Diego's arrival, of Corquera's revelations, is systematically suppressed. Francis is, in the sound design of this film, the silence. He is what extinguishes noise. He is the presence that renders the household quiet in the way that an authoritarian presence renders a room quiet. Not because nothing is happening, but because the consequences of making noise are too clear and too immediate. The zombies outside are loud. They're unmanaged. They don't know about consequences and permissions and approved information channels. They just are what they are, hungry, uncontrolled, making noise. And the film's sound design keeps putting those two audio worlds in deliberate contrast, the managed silence Francis maintains inside and the honest chaos outside. The zombies, in this acoustic framing, are more transparent about what they are than the man who has been quietly, efficiently managing his family's reality for the entire film. At least the zombies don't pretend. One more craft choice that deserves specific examination: the extended single-shot sequence on the bridge where Francis fights through a zombie horde to rescue Lucas. From a pure technical standpoint, this is the film's most impressive achievement: a sustained, choreographed action sequence conducted without a visible cut, executed in what appear to be real conditions with a practical environment that is genuinely thrilling as a piece of action cinema. And it has been cited consistently as the emotional high point of the film, the moment where the audience is unambiguously on Francis's side, where he is unambiguously heroic, where the emotional investment in him as a character is most fully activated. But examine the technical framing of the sequence. The camera stays with Francis throughout. The single-shot formality, the commitment of the camera to remaining with one person continuously without cutting away, is typically used in action cinema to generate identification with that character. We are with them in a way that cutting would disrupt. We feel what they feel because we never leave them. In a film that has, through its cinematographic and editing choices, consistently framed Francis as the watcher and controller, this is the only extended sequence in which the camera commits fully to his physical experience. We are inside his effort, his endurance, his struggle. The formal question is, why here? Why is this the moment where the film grants Francis the most sustained identification through formal technique? The answer the thesis provides: because this is the moment where Francis's love, selective, conditional, possessive, organized around the body and biological ownership of Lucas, finds its most legitimate expression. The single-shot formality validates this moment precisely because, within the narrow terms of Francis's own moral universe, this moment is valid. He is genuinely fighting for the thing he loves most. The camera doesn't lie about that. The commitment of the form is honest, but the same formalism that validates the moment also isolates it. The single-shot sequence is Francis at his most unambiguously decent, and it's the only moment in the film with that quality. The camera has been watching Francis for the entire film, and this is the one time in this duration of sustained formal identification that he gives you something that feels like love. One sequence out of the entire film. And even that love is selective, hierarchical, organized around biology and possession rather than humanity. The craftsmanship here is, whether Ledesma intended it this way or not, extraordinarily precise in what it reveals. The most technically generous moment the film gives Francis is a moment of real but structurally limited love. Framing it with formal sophistication doesn't redeem it. It illuminates exactly what it is. Let me state what the thesis has been arguing in its fullest form, and then let's sit with the implications. Outside 2024 is not about the cycle of abuse. It is not about a man traumatized into becoming his father. It is not, at its generative core, a therapeutic narrative about generational damage, broken homes, and the heartbreaking way that violence perpetuates itself across time. It is a film about how predatory control has always masqueraded as protection, and how what the apocalypse reveals in Francis Abel is not a new monster, but an old one who no longer has to perform. The zombie horde didn't break Francis. It liberated him. Not from trauma, not from his father's ghost, from the performance requirement, from the obligation to pretend that the control was something other than control, that the confinement was something other than confinement, that the burned map was something other than a destroyed exit. Pre-apocalypse, Francis had to perform. He had to be the husband, the father, the provider, the man who loves his family, the man whose controlling tendencies could be reframed at every point as protectiveness, diligence, concern, the social infrastructure of accountability. Diego's external relationship, Iris's access to her own agency, the children's eventual relationship to the outside world was always a constraint on how completely Francis could build the closed system he preferred. The zombies didn't add anything to Francis. They subtracted the social infrastructure. And what remained, what was always there, is what the film shows us in its second and third acts. Here is what accepting this reading demands of us. If Francis always had this, then the question isn't what broke him. The question is what enabled him, and the enabling factors, the cultural architectures of Filipino patriarchal authority, the legal frameworks that made exit difficult, the domestic ideological framework of the protector husband, the Catholic weight of family preservation above individual survival are not specific to the apocalypse. They are the conditions of ordinary life. They are the permission structures that Francis operated within and that men like Francis have always operated within in the ordinary, pre-apocalyptic world. The film's insight, taken to its logical conclusion, is not about what catastrophe does to good men. It's about what ordinary social architecture does for bad ones. The mansion was always there. The locked gate was always available. The information asymmetry between Francis and his family was always constructible. The justification, I'm keeping you safe, the world outside is dangerous, was always available, whether the danger was zombies or debt or Diego or simply the exposure of what Francis was. The zombies are, in this reading, the film's most honest metaphor. They literalize the threat Francis has always used. Every controlling partner has their zombies, their version of the thing outside the gates that makes the confinement necessary, their particular formulation of why the exit is too dangerous, why the map needs to be burned, why the person with external credibility, the Cira, needs to be silenced before he can destabilize the carefully maintained information architecture. Most controlling partner zombies are less visible than the undead. They are financial precarity, social stigma, claimed dangers, manufactured dependencies. But they serve the same structural function. They make the inside seem like the only option. They make the imprisoned person's escape seem like their own risk, their own foolishness, their own responsibility for whatever happens if they try. Outside gives us the literalized version of this dynamic, the version where we can see clearly that the zombies are being weaponized, that the threat is real but the response to it is strategically managed, that safety is the performance cover for a closed system of control. The most disturbing implication of this reading is about timing. If the thesis is correct, if Francis didn't become monstrous but was simply revealed by the removal of social infrastructure, then there's a question that hangs over the entire pre-apocalyptic life of this family. How long was Francis already this way, and what were the pre-apocalyptic version of the burned maps and staged attacks and information monopolies? The film's pre-apocalyptic backstory, assembled from fragments, tells us significant. The affair that produced Joshua predates the outbreak. The marital estrangement predates the outbreak. The financial pressures, the strained relationships, the accumulated grievances, these are all pre-existing conditions. The marriage was already in a state that caused Iris to seek outside connection. She was already, in some sense, trying to escape something. The map was already being, in quieter ways, burned. This is what makes the zombie apocalypse not a dramatic amplifier but a diagnostic instrument. It doesn't show us a version of Francis he couldn't have been without it. It shows us, with unusual clarity, the version of Francis that was always there, stripped of the social protocols that had required him to perform otherwise. The diagnosis is brutal. This is a man who is already doing, in smaller and less visible ways, what the apocalypse gave him permission to do openly. And if the apocalypse had never happened, he would have continued doing it, more slowly, more covertly, with more cover from the ordinary social architectures of accountability, but doing it nonetheless. That's the reckoning this film asks for, not the comfortable one, bad things make bad men. The uncomfortable one, some men are already this way, in ordinary circumstances, operating behind the very social structures we assume are protecting people. But let's complicate the reckoning with the one thing that genuinely complicates it, Lucas: the bridge. The fight through the zombie horde, the single-shot commitment, the genuine, undeniable, physically expressed love. I argued earlier that this is selective, conditional, possessive love, love organized around biological ownership rather than universal humanity. And I stand by that argument. But I also want to give it its full weight. It is love. Whatever else Francis is, whatever else this essay has argued about his strategic coldness and calculated control, the bridge sequence captures something real. He loves his son, his biological son, the one whose possession is certain, the one whose existence doesn't threaten his ownership narrative, yes, but he loves him. With his body, with his effort, with a willingness to walk through the undead for the possibility of getting that child back. This doesn't redeem Francis. Nothing in the essay is arguing for redemption, but it does something more interesting. It shows us how human and how monstrous can coexist without contradiction. Francis loves Lucas. Francis murdered Corcara. Francis burns maps and stages zombie attacks and imprisons his family. And Francis would walk through a horde for his son. These are not contradictory. They're all the same person. A man whose love, like his violence, is organized around the logic of ownership and control, intense, real, and completely conditional on the thing loved being his. The bridge sequence is not a redemption crack in the monster. It is the monster's most human-looking feature, and it is continuous with the monster, not discontinuous from it. Understanding this is the key to understanding the film, and the key to understanding the cultural phenomenon the film is inadequately describing. The people in our lives who do what Francis does are almost never people we recognize as purely monstrous. They love, often fiercely. They protect, sometimes with genuine sacrifice. The love and the control are not separate phenomena, two sides of a coin. One noble and one corrupt. They are the same phenomenon. The love is the possessive system, expressed in its most positive register. This is why the cycle of abuse, reading, is not just insufficient but potentially harmful. It positions the love as evidence of the real Francis, the one the trauma damaged, the one that could be recovered through therapy and healing. It says, the love is who he truly is. The control is what the damage made him. The thesis says the opposite. The love and the control are both who he truly is. They're inseparable. And treating them as separable, treating the love as the truth and the control as the contamination, is exactly the interpretive framework that keeps people in managed households with burned maps and staged zombie attacks, waiting for the real person to emerge from underneath the damage. The real person is already there. So here is what I'm asking you to do. Watch Outside again. Watch it after you've accepted, at least provisionally, the thesis this essay has been building. Watch the early scenes, the pre-breakdown scenes, the scenes before the flashbacks start, and the third act control becomes undeniable. And look for the versions of the staged attack, the burned map, the information monopoly. They're there. They're quieter. They're more socially legible. They have the cover of normalcy, but they're there. Watch Francis decide what the family knows about the outside world. Watch him position himself as the sole interpreter of the zombie threat. Watch the way Iris's agency is constrained not by locks and literal confinement, but by the softer architecture of claimed expertise, managed information, the gentle but persistent insistence that he knows better, that the outside is more dangerous than she understands, that her instinct toward exit is naive. The mansion was always locked. The zombies just made the lock visible. And then think about what this film is saying, not about the apocalypse, but about ordinary life. Think about the ordinary architectures of protection that function in some households the way the mansion functions for Francis. the financial dependencies that function as locked gates, the social isolation that functions as a perimeter wall, the claimed expertise and information management that function as the Francis as sole radio authority system, the love that is real and fierce and completely organized around the logic of ownership. Think about the Corcuras in your own life, the people with external credibility, with information that contradicts the managed narrative of the closed domestic system, and ask what happens to them, whether they're murdered in the theatrical sense, or whether their information is discredited, their intentions questioned, their reliability undermined, until they might as well be wearing a dead man's uniform for all the impact their truth has on the household's information landscape. Outside isn't asking whether you'd survive a zombie apocalypse. It's asking whether you already live in one, whether the thing keeping you inside has always had less to do with the threat at the gate and more to do with the man who says he's the only one who understands it. The zombies are real in this film. The threat is real. The confinement has, in purely material terms, a genuine partial justification. That's the most disturbing thing about it. That's the whole argument. Because the cases that are easiest to see are the ones where the threat is obviously manufactured, where the zombies are obviously fake, where the locked door has no material justification whatsoever. Those cases are clear. They're still missed all the time, but they're clear. The cases where the threat is real, where there genuinely are dangers outside, where the person claiming to manage them genuinely does have relevant expertise, where some of the confinement genuinely is protective. Those are the cases where the Francis dynamic is hardest to see and hardest to escape, because the protection is real. And the control hides behind the protection so completely that distinguishing one from the other requires a precision of observation that even trained professionals struggle to apply. Outside puts you in that ambiguity. It gives you real zombies and a real protector and a real threat, and then shows you, slowly, that the real threat was always behind the locked door rather than in front of it. And when you see it, when you finally clearly see it, you realize you saw the signs early. You saw the information management. You saw the map burning. You saw the staged attack. You saw the coldness beneath the protector's performance. You saw the love that was real, but organized entirely around possession. You saw it, and you explained it away. Because the story about the cycle of abuse and the trauma flashbacks and the man who was damaged by his father was easier to hold than the alternative. The alternative is that the damage wasn't what made him this way. The damage was always his alibi. And the apocalypse, the beautiful, terrible, perfect apocalypse, was just the moment he stopped needing one. Outside 2024. Directed by Carlo Ledesma. Written by Carlo Ledesma and Ray Red. Starring Sid Lucero, Beauty Gonzalez, Marco Masa, Aiden Tyler Padu. Netflix Philippines. October 2024. Let's talk about you. Not Francis, not Iris, not Diego or Corcura or the children or Ledesma. You. The person who watched outside and, somewhere between the first flashback and the dinner table revelation, felt something soften toward Francis. The person who heard the basement backstory and nodded slightly with the particular nod of someone who has just received information that explains something they found troubling. The person who, by the time Francis was staging zombie attacks and burning maps and wearing a dead man's uniform, was still running he's traumatized, he's the product of his father's violence. This is what the cycle of abuse looks like. Narrative as a background process in their interpretation of what they were watching. The critical consensus did it. The reviews did it. The Reddit threads did it. The majority of audience responses to Outside process Francis through the cycle of abuse frame with a speed and consistency that suggests not deliberate interpretation, but something more like reflex, the automatic deployment of a pre-existing explanatory framework the moment the flashback footage appeared. That reflex is not neutral. That reflex is the subject of this module. Because Francis doesn't just need zombies. He doesn't just need a mansion with a lockable basement. He doesn't just need an information monopoly and a staged attack and a map to burn. He needs, more fundamentally than any of that, an ecology of people who will interpret him charitably, who will reach reliably and quickly for the most sympathetic available explanation of what he does, who will take the alibi and run with it. He has always had that. The film, in embedding it within the audience's own interpretive behavior, reveals it. And here is the reckoning the essay has been building toward without quite naming: the most effective control system Francis runs in outside is not the locked gate, not the burn map, not the murdered soldier. It is the narrative, the story he tells about himself, the backstory that converts his behavior in the minds of the people around him and the people watching him from predation into pathos. The most effective tool in Francis's arsenal is the one he didn't even build himself. It was pre-existing, installed in everyone around him, available on demand. The alibi is cultural, and every person who reached for it, inside the film and outside it, is the accomplice this module is about. Start with Iris, because she is the accomplice who matters most and the one the film treats with the most complexity. Iris knows. That needs to be said clearly before anything else. She knows what Francis is. She has always known. Not in the clean, articulable way of someone who has processed their situation fully and named it correctly, but in the way you know things that you can't afford to fully know. The body knows. The instincts know. The affair with Diego wasn't just loneliness and proximity. It was the reaching of someone in a managed environment toward the one person who offered information without gatekeeping it, connection without ownership, presence without surveillance. Diego, whatever else the film says about him, gave Iris something. Not just the affair, not just Joshua, but a model of what unmanaged, unchoreographed male attention felt like. He didn't stage the approach. He didn't control what she knew. He didn't burn her map. The contrast with Francis was not accidental. It was the whole point of the affair, whether Iris could articulate it or not. So, Iris knows. In her body. In the choice she made. In the specific form of the alternative she reached for. But watch what Iris does with what she knows, and watch how the film watches her do it. Every time Iris reaches the edge of the full knowledge, every time the behavior in front of her is undeniable enough that the sympathetic re-explanation starts to strain, she performs the re-explanation anyway. She reaches for the "he's struggling" frame, the "this is the apocalypse doing this to him" frame, the "he was damaged by his father and this is what that damage looks like" frame. She reaches for these frames not because they're false. They contain genuine truth, but because they are more bearable than the alternative. Because the alternative, fully acknowledged, requires a response that the closed system of the mansion makes unavailable. This is the trap of the charitable interpretation. It isn't stupidity. It isn't weakness. It is a rational adaptation to an environment in which full knowledge has no productive outlet. If Iris fully acknowledges what Francis is, not a traumatized man cycling his father's damage, but a predator who has found the optimal conditions for his program, then she has to act on that knowledge. She has to attempt the exit. In a world with zombies at the gate and a burned map and a dead soldier's absence, the exit attempt looks like suicide. So she doesn't fully acknowledge it. She manages her own knowledge the way Francis manages the household's information. She applies the charitable rereading to herself. She survives psychologically by maintaining the version of Francis she can live with rather than the version that would require her to do something she cannot currently do. The film is not sympathetic to Francis in this moment. It is honest about Iris. And the honesty it extends to Iris is the film's most important moral gesture. It shows us that the accomplice is not a fool. The accomplice is often the most perceptive person in the room, the person who knows the truth most clearly, and who has calculated correctly that in the current architecture of the closed system, knowing the truth fully and acting on it immediately are not options available simultaneously. Iris is not an enabler in the simple sense. She is a person in a managed environment making the rational survival calculation that the managed environment requires. And the sadness of her situation, the specific, irreducible sadness that the film generates through Beauty Gonzalez's performance, is not the sadness of a woman who couldn't see what was happening. It's the sadness of a woman who could see exactly what was happening and was navigating at every moment between the truth she carried and the situation that made the truth's full expression temporarily impossible. The charitable rereading of Francis is, for Iris, a survival tool. That's what the film shows. That's the complicity that matters, not stupidity or denial, but the rational management of unbearable knowledge in an environment that punishes the full expression of it. Diego is dead before the film's third act fully arrives. He dies off screen, having guided other families toward the safe zone, having tried to get Iris and her children out, having sacrificed himself in what appears to be a genuine act of altruistic heroism. And then he comes back as a zombie, and Francis kills him. That's Diego's arc, structurally. And the essay needs to say something about what that arc does to the thesis, because Diego's existence in the film is not incidental. He is the thesis's most important character, and the one that has received the least serious critical attention. Diego is the living counter-argument to every apologist claim made on Francis's behalf. The most persistent charitable reading of Francis is the situational one. The apocalypse is genuinely terrible. The decisions he makes are extreme, but the extremity of the situation partly explains them. There is no available model for how to behave well under these conditions. Francis is improvising under impossible pressure and improvising badly. But improvising. Nobody knows what the right thing to do is. Diego knows. Diego, under the same apocalyptic conditions, facing the same zombie threat with fewer resources and less information and a more exposed position. Diego does it right. He identifies a safe zone. He creates a map. He shares the map with others. He guides families towards safety at personal cost. He risks himself for people who are not his biological possessions, who are not his owned family, who are not the repositories of his genetic investment. Diego does not stage zombie attacks. Diego does not murder witnesses. Diego does not burn the maps other people need. The film puts Diego in the story specifically to demolish the impossible circumstances mitigation. Francis had a model. A real, specific, flesh-and-blood model of how a man of comparable resourcefulness could navigate the same environment without predation. He rejected the model. He killed the man who embodied it, and then he wore the dead man's uniform. You could not write a more precise formal refutation of the Francis had no choice reading than the Diego arc. The film literally provides an alternative. Another man, same conditions, different behavior, and then shows Francis destroying that alternative. The charitable interpretation of Francis cannot survive contact with Diego, which is why, in the critical reception, Diego is almost never seriously discussed. The cycle of abuse. Reading doesn't have space for Diego because Diego's existence makes the cycle of abuse reading untenable. So he gets mentioned in plot summary. Iris's lover, Francis's brother, the source of the paternity question, and then set aside. That critical sidestep is itself a form of the accomplice behavior. You can't look at Diego seriously and maintain the sympathy for Francis that the generous reading requires. So Diego gets looked away from. He's narratively inconvenient. His arc is, in the economy of the film's critical reception, the piece of evidence that the jury has been quietly asked not to deliberate on. Diego is the Cira of the critical discourse. Inconvenient information managed into silence. There's a smaller accomplice story embedded in the film that almost no one has discussed, and it's the one that carries the sharpest edge. Joshua sees it first. Not Iris, not Diego, not the audience. Joshua, the child, the one Francis never fully claimed, the one whose paternity was always a source of ambient threat to Francis's ownership narrative. Joshua is the character who most directly confronts Francis about the map, about the lies, about what is actually happening inside the mansion. Children who grow up in managed environments often develop a precision of perception about the controlling adult that the other adults in the household cannot afford to develop. Because children don't have the same survival calculation to make, they haven't yet fully internalized the cost of seeing clearly, they haven't learned to self-manage their own knowledge the way Iris has. Joshua sees Francis clearly. He finds the map. He knows what it means. He understands what burning it meant. And the film is precise about the specific cruelty of Francis's response to Joshua's clarity. He doesn't just suppress the knowledge. He weaponizes it. He uses the dinner table revelation, the public exposure of Joshua's paternity, to punish Joshua for seeing too clearly, to make Joshua's clear sight the source of his own public humiliation, to teach Joshua that the cost of perception is exposure. This is the final sophistication of Francis's control architecture. It doesn't just suppress rebellion. It converts the act of perception itself into something the perceiver has to pay for. Joshua sees the truth and is punished, publicly, in a way that makes the other children witness the punishment. The lesson taught to the entire household is, this is what happens when you look clearly at things. This is the cost of perception. Don't. The accomplice dynamic, in Joshua's case, is about what happens to children raised in the ecology of charitable interpretation. The lesson of the managed environment transmitted across a generation is not, don't trust your father. It's more corrosive than that. It's don't trust your own eyes. Your perception of the situation is less reliable than the explanation provided by the person who manages the situation. That lesson, installed young, is the most durable product of the Francis architecture, not the burned map, not the locked basement. The epistemological damage, the child who learns that their own clear perception is dangerous. Let me make the most uncomfortable argument this essay makes. The critical consensus on outside, the cycle of abuse, the generational trauma, the sympathetic Francis reading that softens his behavior into pathos is not a neutral analytic error. It is not simply a case of smart people reaching the wrong conclusion. It is the audience performing, on a cultural scale, the exact same charitable reinterpretation that Iris performs domestically, and that Joshua is punished for not performing. The audience looked at Francis. The audience received the flashback. The audience felt the pull of the backstory, the weight of the father in the basement, the genuine awfulness of what was done to the child Francis once was. And the audience reached quickly, reflexively, en masse, for the cycle of abuse reading, not because it's the most accurate reading, but because it's the most bearable one. The most accurate reading requires you to hold two things simultaneously without resolving the tension between them. Francis's suffering was real, and Francis is a predator who exploited that suffering as an alibi. The trauma was genuine, and it was strategically deployed. The love for Lucas was real, and it was organized around the logic of ownership. That double holding is hard. It requires a kind of moral cognitive load that the cycle of abuse reading relieves. The cycle of abuse reading gives you a single through line, bad past, chew bad present, causally clean, morally navigable. It lets you feel sad for Francis and angry at Francis simultaneously, without having to sit with the more disturbing possibility that Francis's sadness was itself a tool. The charitable interpretation is more comfortable. It is also, this essay has argued, exactly what Francis counts on, not just from Iris, not just from Diego, not just from Joshua, from everyone in his world who might otherwise hold him accountable. You can feel bad about this. The point isn't to make you feel stupid for landing on the sympathetic reading. The critical consensus is smart people doing what the film's structure encouraged them to do. Ledesma built the flashbacks in. He placed them. He made the father's violence vivid and specific. He gave Francis a generous backstory and then relied on the audience to extend it the same charitable interpretation that the generous backstory is designed to generate. But here's what this essay is asking you to do. Having seen the structure of the thing, notice the reflex. Notice how quickly the alibi arrived. Notice how the backstory performed the function it was designed to perform, not just within the film's diegesis, where it manages Iris's perception of Francis, but in your own interpretive experience, where it managed yours. Because the families of people like Francis don't need the zombie apocalypse as the setting for their situation. They're in it right now. In ordinary houses, in ordinary cities, with ordinary arguments and ordinary money and ordinary social architectures of accountability that are, in their own quiet ways, just as inadequate as the apocalyptic version. And in those ordinary houses, the alibi does the same work it does in the mansion. The backstory generates the same charitable reflex. That he had a difficult childhood, he's struggling. This is what the cycle looks like. Frame is available, credible, and perpetually deployable. And the people in those houses, the Irises managing their own knowledge, the Joshuas learning the cost of clear perception, are waiting for someone to do what the critical consensus on outside mostly refused to do. Look at what he actually does, rather than at what his history says he's doing. Watch the map burn. Watch the soldier die. Watch him put on the uniform and walk back into the room and lie. Watch his face. Don't look at the flashback. Look at him. He's not unraveling. He's working. And everyone who believed the alibi inside the mansion and outside it, on the screen and in the cinema, was part of what made the work possible. That's the real horror of outside. Not the cycle of abuse, not the generational trauma, not the zombies at the gate. The horror is how good the alibi is. The horror is how readily we use it. The horror is that Francis knew we would. He's always known. Here is the argument this entire essay has been building toward without fully naming. Francis Abel is not a unique monster. He is not a psychological aberration, not an exceptional case study, not the unlucky product of one specific chain of familial damage that produced, in one specific man, a set of behaviors that the rest of Filipino society would recognize as alien and aberrant. He is, instead, a recognizable type, a type with institutional precedent, a type whose specific combination of real external threat, managed information, destroyed exits, staged crises, murdered witnesses, and weaponized victimhood has appeared before in Philippine history, not in a mansion, but in a palace, not over a family of 4, but over an archipelago of 70 million. The mansion is the Philippines. The locked gate is martial law. The burned map is a suppressed press. The zombies are the communists, the insurgents, the drug addicts, the terrorists, the perpetual revolving door threat that every authoritarian iteration of the Filipino state has needed to justify the closed system. And Francis, strategic, cold-eyed, genuinely loving toward the things he owns, deploying his own suffering as the alibi for his control, killing the witnesses who carry contradictory information and wearing their credibility like a uniform. Francis is the patriarch. Not a patriarch, the prototype. The household-scale model of the political formation that has defined Filipino governance at its most authoritarian for more than half a century. This is not metaphor. This is structure, the same structure, operating at different scales. The Marcos template. Ferdinand Marcos Sr. declared martial law in the Philippines on September 21, 1972. The official justification was a real external threat. Communist insurgency, the new People's Army, the specter of violent revolution that had been genuinely present in the Philippine political landscape for years. The communists were, in this sense, the zombies. Real, documented, capable of genuine violence, not manufactured from nothing. But what Marcos did with the real threat is the Francis move, executed at national scale. First, the information monopoly. Within days of the martial law declaration, Marcos had shut down newspapers, television stations, and radio broadcasts that were not aligned with his administration. He became, overnight, the sole authoritative interpreter of the national situation. What was happening in the provinces, how serious the insurgency was, whether the emergency measures were proportionate, all of this was routed through Marcos before anyone else got to weigh in. He decided what the nation knew. He decided what the threats meant. He decided whether the situation was improving or worsening. And, consistently, he decided it was worsening in ways that required the continuation of emergency measures. This is Francis managing the radio. Francis deciding what the sounds outside the mansion mean. Francis, whose assessment of the zombie threat is the only assessment that counts inside the closed system. Second, the destroyed exits. Marcos suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He abolished Congress. He placed the judiciary under effective executive control. He created the legal architecture and then the physical infrastructure of detention, surveillance, and travel restriction that made exit from the system he was building as difficult as possible. For the people most likely to navigate toward the safe zone, the political opposition, the independent press, the civil society organizations, Marcos systematically eliminated the mechanisms of departure. The map burners weren't metaphorical. They were real. The Constitutional Convention delegates who voted against the Marcos Constitution were arrested. The opposition senators who challenged the declaration were imprisoned. The journalists who reported contradictory information were shut down, exiled, or killed. Third, the staged crisis. The Plaza Miranda bombing of 1971, the grenades thrown into an opposition Liberal Party rally that killed and wounded hundreds, was publicly attributed by Marcos to communist insurgents and used as the justification for suspending habeas corpus even before formal martial law. Subsequent historical research, including the testimony of former Marcos operatives and the documentary record assembled by historians, has pointed strongly toward Marcos's own operatives as the actual perpetrators. The consensus among serious historians is that Marcos staged or enabled the crisis he used to justify the emergency measures. He went outside, he created the disturbance. He came back in and confirmed that the threat was worse than anyone had thought. Fourth, the murdered witnesses. The exact count of political killings during the Marcos martial law era is contested. Amnesty International's estimates begin at 3,257 documented extrajudicial killings. Human rights organizations count over 70,000 detained, over 34,000 tortured. Benigno Aquino, the most prominent court cura, the returning witness with direct knowledge of what the safe zone looked like and a credible alternative account of the national situation, was shot on the tarmac of Manila International Airport in 1983 as he stepped off the plane. He had information that contradicted the Marcos narrative of national stability and prosperity. He was killed in front of witnesses and in front of cameras, and the regime spent years constructing an alternative account of who had ordered the murder. He killed the soldier. He wore the uniform. The parallel is not poetic. It is structural. The Francis architecture and the Marcos architecture are the same architecture. The household scale version and the national scale version differ in the number of people inside the closed system and the mechanisms available for enforcement. The logic, real threat, managed information, destroyed exits, staged crises, murdered witnesses, weaponized victimhood is identical, and the alibi is identical. Marcos, throughout the martial law years and after, deployed his own version of the backstory. The Philippines was not ready for full democracy. The external threats were real and required extraordinary measures. He had given the best years of his life to the nation. The opposition was naive about the communist threat, idealistic in ways that would get people killed. He understood things that his critics, from their positions of safety and comfort, could not. The sacrifices he was asking were for the family, the national family, not for himself. The victimhood apparatus at national scale, the suffering real or real enough, the alibi generated, extended, believed by enough people for long enough to make the closed system durable. Bang Bang and the flashback as national policy. In May 2022, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. won the Philippine presidential election with 31.6 million votes, the largest plurality in the nation's post-dictatorship electoral history. He ran on a platform of national unity that was, structurally, a request for the national charitable interpretation. The Marcos era, in Bongbong's campaign framing, was not a period of authoritarian atrocity. It was a golden age of national development, security, and prosperity, misrepresented by a biased opposition historiography that had never forgiven the Marcos family for doing what was necessary. The human rights abuses were exaggerated or fabricated. The martial law economy was genuinely strong. The sacrifices asked were proportionate to the threats faced. This is not ancient history. It was the campaign platform that generated the largest presidential mandate in post-Marcos Philippine history. This is the flashback as national policy, the nation reaching back for the backstory. The cycle of abuse reading applied to a country. The Marcos era was shaped by threats and pressures that explain its methods. An explanation is the same as exculpation, and exculpation is the same as restoration, and restoration is the same as the son returning to the mansion. The bongbong phenomenon, which requires a separate essay in its full complexity, is not the subject here. What's relevant is the structural parallel to the thesis, a sufficiently compelling alibi, delivered with enough emotional conviction and enough genuine partial truth, can convert a history of predatory control into a history of protective necessity, can make the burned maps look like difficult wartime decisions, can make the murdered witnesses look like unfortunate casualties of a genuine emergency, can make the closed system look, in retrospect, like the only available refuge from the zombies that were genuinely, objectively outside. The charitable interpretation is the most renewable political resource in the Philippine rights arsenal. It was available in 1972. It was available in 2022. It will be available in 2028 and 2034 and every subsequent election in which the Marcos political brand requires rehabilitation, because the backstory is always there. The suffering of the nation, real suffering, genuine historical trauma, the poverty and instability and external pressure that made Marcos's pitch to a frightened electorate credible in 1972 is always available as the raw material for the alibi. The question the thesis asks of the Marcos political history is the same question it asks of Francis. When did the suffering become the alibi? When did the real threat become the justification for a closed system that served the threat manager's interests far more than it served the people it claimed to protect? When did the zombie horde become the cover story rather than the actual problem? The answer, this essay argues, is the same in both cases. It was always both. The threat was real, and the exploitation of the threat was strategic simultaneously from the beginning. The communists were real, and Marcos used them. The zombies are real, and Francis uses them. These are not contradictions. They are the defining structure of authoritarian patriarchal control. The genuine threat and its strategic deployment are inseparable because the genuine threat is what makes the strategic deployment credible. You cannot have the alibi without the zombie. And so the zombie is, in a specific and terrible sense, necessary. Protected, maintained, made as visible and as terrifying as possible. Because a world without zombies is a world in which the Francis architecture has no justification and the Marcos architecture has no mandate. The patriarch needs the apocalypse the way the dictator needs the emergency. Not because the apocalypse and the emergency are inventions, they're often real, but because without them, the closed system cannot be sold as protection. This is what Outside encodes in its central conceit and what the cycle of abuse reading systematically fails to see. The zombies are not the problem the film is about. The zombies are the franchise model that makes the problem possible. Kisap, Mata, finally, completed. Mike de Leon made Kisap Mata in 1981 during year 9 of the Marcos martial law era and embedded in it a domestic horror so specifically calibrated to the political reality of its moment that the allegorical connection was, for its original Filipino audience, neither subtle nor ambiguous. Dong, the retired police officer who cannot release his daughter, who would rather see his family destroyed than see them free, who exercises total dominion over the closed system of his household through the institutional authority of his former state role. Dong is the martial law patriarch made domestic. De Leon's film does not explain Dong. It does not give him a backstory. It does not offer the cycle of abuse, mitigation. It watches him the way you watch a political fact, with cold clarity and without the relief of psychological explanation. The horror of Kisap Mata is the horror of something that does not require a reason to be true. Dong controls his family because he can, because the social, legal, and institutional architecture of his world gives him the tools to do it and insulates him from the consequences of doing it. He doesn't need trauma, he needs permission. And the permission structures, familial, cultural, legal, institutional, are in full operation throughout the film, yielding to him at every point where they might have checked him. This is the Marcos architecture rendered at household scale. The patriarch whose institutional authority, cop, president, husband, father, is itself the enabling condition for the control. No backstory required, no psychological explanation necessary. The structural permission is sufficient. Outside, 43 years later, updates the model. Ledesma's Francis is not a cop, not a state agent, not a formally institutional patriarch. He is a private bourgeois husband in a post-institutional world, a world in which the formal authority structures of the Dong era have been, at least nominally, dismantled. There is no more martial law. There is, again, nominally, a functioning judiciary. The legal architecture that made Dong's control so impervious has been modified, if not transformed. So Francis's control is softer, more privatized, less institutionally backed, and more ideologically operated. The information monopoly is not a press shutdown. It's the subtle, deniable management of what his family hears and believes. The destroyed exits are not travel restrictions. They're burned maps and killed soldiers and a sustained narrative about the zombie threat that makes leaving seem like suicide. The staged crises are not Plaza Miranda. They're a domestic disturbance outside the gates that only Francis witnesses and only Francis can report. The evolution from Dong to Francis is not the democratization of Filipino domestic life. It is the privatization of authoritarian control. The move from the institutional patriarch, who needs the state's backing to maintain the closed system, to the ideological patriarch, who maintains the closed system through narrative management alone. And narrative management is harder to prosecute than a baton. It leaves fewer marks. It generates more plausible deniability. It produces, reliably, the charitable interpretation from the people around it, because there's no smoking baton, no visible wound, just a man who manages the information and has a backstory that explains his behavior and loves his family in the specific, conditional, possessive way that passes in the ordinary cultural assessment for love. The privatization of authoritarian control is the Filipino horror story of the post-Marcos Jr. era. And Outside, whether Ledesma fully intended this political layer or not, lands squarely inside it. The mansion is not a metaphor for the Philippines. It is a model of it, a household-scale prototype of the governance architecture that the nation has returned to through the Marcos restoration as the dominant political mode of the contemporary moment. The zombie horde is not a metaphor for the communist insurgency or the drug war or any specific national emergency. It is a model of how national emergencies function within authoritarian governance as the permission structure that makes the closed system credible. And Francis, managing his four-person nation with the same tools, the same logic, the same alibi, the same structure as the men who have managed the 70 million person nation, is not a private horror. He is a political education. The zombie is national Francis. Every Filipino authoritarian project has needed its zombie horde, and every zombie horde has had the same structural characteristics, real enough to be credible, frightening enough to generate genuine fear, but managed, kept visible, kept threatening, kept useful, in ways that serve the control architecture rather than the population it claims to protect. The Marcos communists were real. The NPA existed. The threat was genuine, and Marcos managed the threat in ways that served his closed system, not eliminating it, not genuinely resolving the structural conditions that generated it, but keeping it present, keeping it threatening, adjusting its visibility according to the political requirements of the moment. The Duterte drug war enemies were real. Drug addiction and drug-related violence were genuine social problems, and Duterte managed them in ways that generated a body count among the poor rather than a functional disruption of the actual narcotics networks, maintaining the visibility of the threat while the structural conditions that produced it remained entirely untouched. The zombie, in Philippine political history, is not eliminated. It is administered, kept alive enough to stay frightening, kept manageable enough that the claim of protection remains credible. The Francis architecture doesn't want the zombies gone. It wants the zombies at the right distance, close enough to justify the locked gate, far enough that the family doesn't try to run through them. This is the political unconscious of the zombie genre that Outside activates most fully. More fully than any of the Romero films, more fully than most Western zombie cinema, because it is a Filipino film made in a specific political moment by a director who has spoken about wanting to make something only Filipinos can understand, about a country that has direct, living, contemporary experience of the strategic administration of national threats for political purposes. The Filipino audience that watched Outside in October 2024, 2 years into the Marcos Jr. administration, with the historical revisionism of the 2022 campaign fresh in their political memory, with the cycle of abuse, reading of the Marcos dynasty, Marcos Sr., was shaped by the Cold War, by the pressures of a fragile democracy, by the genuine communist threat. You can understand why he did what he did even if you condemn it. Available as the dominant narrative of the election that had just put the sun in the palace. That audience was watching a film about their immediate political moment, even if the film never names a president or a martial law decree. The Reddit discussion of Outside in the Philippine subreddit is, in this context, extraordinarily revealing. Filipino audience members debated whether the film's sympathetic treatment of Francis was appropriate, whether the cycle of abuse framing let him off too easily, whether the film was excusing his behavior by providing the backstory. The debate in the comments was not just about a fictional patriarch. It was, in a displaced and sometimes explicit way, about exactly the question the Marcos restoration had just forced the country to answer. Is the backstory sufficient? Does the suffering explain the control? Is understanding the alibi the same as accepting it? The Filipinos who watched Outside and argued about whether Francis deserved sympathy were arguing, in the register of genre cinema, about whether the Philippines deserved the charitable interpretation it had just extended to the Marcos family. The film caught that argument in amber. The essay ends where it has to, not with a resolution, but with the full weight of what the thesis implies. Outside is a film about Francis Abel, a Filipino patriarch who used a zombie apocalypse to build a closed system of total domestic control and deployed his childhood trauma as the alibi for everything he did. That is what the film is about at the level of the individual character, and the previous 7 modules have argued that case in exhaustive detail. But the film is also, inescapably, a film about the country that produced Francis and the country that will recognize him, not as an alien horror, but as a familiar type, a type with precedent, a type whose specific combination of real threat, managed information, destroyed exits, and weaponized victimhood has governed the Philippines at various scales and in various iterations for longer than anyone currently alive has been alive. The mansion has always been there. The locked gate has always been available. The map has been burned before, in bigger fires, by hands with more institutional authority, and the people inside the closed system have reached, then as now, for the charitable interpretation that made the burning comprehensible if not acceptable. The Kisat Mata patriarch was a cop. The outside patriarch is a husband. The next iteration will be something else, softer, more privatized, more narratively sophisticated, more capable of generating the charitable interpretation at scale. Unless someone, somewhere in the closed system, decides to stop applying the alibi and start watching what he actually does. Watch the map burn. Watch the soldier die. Watch him put on the uniform. Watch the face. He's not unraveling. He's building. And the country outside the mansion, the country that keeps electing the son of the man in the basement, that keeps reaching for the backstory as the explanation, that keeps burning its own map because the alternative requires an exit that feels impossible. That country is Iris. It knows. It has always known. It is waiting still for the moment when knowing and acting on what you know can finally happen at the same time. That is what Outside is actually about. And it is worth every minute of the discomfort of seeing it clearly.